Assalamu alaikum and peace be unto you. My name is Mohammed Al-Sanusi. I am a board member for the Islamic Society of North America. I would like to welcome you all for this ISNA virtual platform. And we have established this platform at the Islamic Society of North America to engage the community in a number of topics and issues. And tonight, the program for the platform is going to focus on what is going on in our country today. Everybody noticed in the past almost now 2 weeks, the country is going through a difficult time because of this racist killing of George Floyd. And tonight we wanted to have a discussion on that to see what is the interreligious and interfaith take on this, and particularly we have been working as an interreligious communities together addressing a number of issues. And this is really an issue that is now in our country, and it really requires a whole of society approach. There is no a single community or a single group or a single administration or a single body can do address this issue. It requires what we call it a whole of society approach. All segment of society should really involve in addressing this issue. So tonight, our discussion theme is police, prejudice, and the prophetic paradigm. And this is really, for that we have requested esteemed panel and assembled quite national leaders and global leaders also in that sense from the interreligious communities to address the issue and how we can discuss the theme and move on to the discussion that we hope to lead us to something that is we can take together as an interreligious communities as we are trying to fix the broken in our nation here. So I wanted to begin briefly by introducing our first speaker, who is really doesn't need any introduction, but Professor Jimmy Jones. He is currently an executive vice president for the Islamic Seminary of America. And he is a professor and known theologian as well in our communities, in the Muslim communities, and in the country as well. He has been speaking across the country in a number of topics related to theology and education as well. So Professor Jones, I wanted to turn to you first, and I will be introducing our speakers as we move along, because we really wanted to have an interactive discussion. So there is no kind of a long conversation or 10-minute presentation here, but we wanted to have an engaging discussion on this issue on hand. So Professor Jones, the question to you, and you are the one that suggested the title for tonight's discussion, Police, Prejudice, and the Prophetic Paradigm. What makes you to think about those terms in the light of what is going on in our nation today? Professor Jones.
Thank you. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat wassalam ala rasulillah. I'm sitting in a Dwight neighborhood of New Haven, Connecticut. It's an inner city neighborhood. It's primarily people by Black and brown people. What does that have to do with the police? Our neighborhood has a reputation to live down as being a, quote, dangerous neighborhood. Our neighborhood is full of formerly incarcerated people. The place, my neighbors include these people. There are many hardworking people in my neighborhood, but there are also many, quote, formerly incarcerated people. Amongst those formerly incarcerated people, there are people who have been victims of or victimizers around gun violence. This is the neighborhood I live in, and some of the discrimination that we see from the police department comes from these perceptions having to do with our neighborhood, with the formerly incarcerated people, and the number of guns that we find on the streets of New Haven, like many, 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 many cities in New Haven. In the state of Connecticut, it seems like only yesterday when young school children went to school and they were murdered, 5 and 6 years old. I remember thinking at the time that we have to do something about gun violence. I was thinking that people don't care about Black children shooting each other in my Dwight neighborhood, but surely they're going to care about these little babies, these 5 and 6 year old babies who are a diverse group of people, Jewish, white, Hispanic. But as it turns out, we as a country, we haven't changed. And so I sit here in the Dwight neighborhood and say that one of the issues between us and the police is that when they come into our neighborhood, they're at the ready. 23 years ago, in a similar neighborhood across town, the Hill neighborhood where I used to live, my son was gunned down by a police officer. Similar thing, a neighborhood of bad reputation, a neighborhood that had many people who were formerly incarcerated, and a neighborhood that had lots of guns in the street, due primarily to national policy. So when I think of the police, I mean, I have strong feelings of outrage in terms of what's going on in this country, but all of the outrage does not land at the feet of the police officers, simply because this issue of the way we incarcerate people, this issue of the number of guns on the street is all of our issues, because there's some people who can make policy. When it comes to prejudice, let's understand that prejudice is a very, very powerful thing. And so prejudice can make you look at something that's white and look at it as being Black. I'll give you an example because it has to do with the kinds of neighborhood I grew up in, the neighborhood I live in. Let's look at the word riot, for instance. I would offer that a riot is a riot no matter who precipitates it and no matter who participates in it. That a riot is a riot no matter who precipitates it or no matter who participates in it. The reason I say this is that I'm an academic. I have a privileged job, even though I'm a Black person in the United States of America. And I've listened to numerous academics talk about riots being rebellions, being uprising, and they're understandable. When I was a young kid growing up in the segregated South, where I went to segregated schools, one of the lessons I learned very early before I converted to Islam was there's no right way to do a wrong thing. If you decide, and I'm talking about a minority of people here, I'm not bracketing the peaceful protests, but if you decide, this minority of people decide to destroy property and put other people's lives at danger and destroy other people's livelihood, that's a riot. But we often lead with our anger when we say these things. But if we looked at history, we'll find out that the riot that's most likely to happen in this country over the years are white people rioting against whatever the target du jour is that day, whether they're Asians or Catholics, rioting against Italians, rioting against, of course, Black people. So prejudice is a very dangerous thing. It is destroying the very fabric of our country. And we in this country are at an existential moment. What do I mean by this? That we need to decide what kind of country we're going to be. Because the reality is that we've devolved into a country that's very intolerant and very prejudiced from all sides. I'm going to wrap because you wanted this to be brief. I just wanted to use the example of one of the people killed by a police officer in this country who often is not talked about. It was January the 5th, 2005. A woman who was a medical doctor was driving home. She encountered an accident. A young boy was injured and she rushed, of course, she happened to be a Muslim and she was a humanitarian to help the young boy. But because she was Black, a white man coming along called the police on her to stop her from helping the young boy. The police arrived, they pulled her off the young boy, and they slammed her to the ground. 51-year-old Black woman who happened to be a medical doctor. She got up and she swung her arm and they did a leg sweep on this 51-year-old Black woman who happened to be a medical doctor. This is the country we live in. They threw her in the back of a police car, right? Like a sack of potatoes. Another man came along and saw her in the back of the police car and say, hey, this woman is foaming at the mouth. She's really hurt. The officer says, I have to find the other officer because I don't have the keys. It took 10 minutes. And the hospital is only 5 minutes away. Remember this name, Dr. Jamila, right? Yasmin Arshad, 51 years old. She was an all-American person. Why do I say this? First of all, she was an immigrant. This country is built on immigration, either forced or voluntary. Second of all, she was a dreamer. She came here, she worked hard, she went to school, she did the right things. She became a medical doctor, she was a neurologist, go look it up. And she ends up being killed because she's Black. This is the kind of country we live in. Never mind that if you're a Black woman and you go to the hospital, you're 4 times as likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth than a white woman. Never mind that, because that's the reality right now. And so we are at an existential moment. And the George Floyd killing has awakened many of us who weren't noticing all these other things until now. But as we Muslims say, alhamdulillah, people are noticing, and we need to do something about it. My final point. The prophetic paradigm teaches me that first of all, we need to examine our niyyah. Why are we doing what we're doing? You know, matters are by intention. This is a famous hadith. And I would recommend to people to go to the Muslim Art website and take the sacred pledge, because one of the first things you do is you decide that you're going to do something about this. This is the prophetic paradigm. You have to decide. You have to make it your intention, and you have to make your intention before God that you're going to do something about this. This is a start. I'll stop here because we have other panelists, and I've talked for a while. I have other suggestions, but inshallah, as the conversation goes on, I can make them. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones, and thank you for putting context of the theme of the discussion tonight. And really, you touch upon a number of issues that really we have to try to deal with them throughout the hour here in this panel. But moving forward, maybe I want to turn into you, Sister Aisha, here, because you know Professor Jones touched upon the police, the prejudice, and also talk about the vulnerables in our communities as well. Those who are really, impacted or affected or more vulnerable in our communities, as you know, even from this police brutality that we see today. So how do you want to put any context to this? Do you want to tell us how we can really moving forward to bring to the surface these issues and also suggest some kind of solutions to them?
Assalamu alaikum. Well, first of all, brother, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to join you in this conversation. The context that I can bring is that we are facing in real time the full impact of structural racism and white supremacy. And I think that the best way that we can begin to deal with this in an effective manner is to acknowledge the fact of that the fact of that, and to find ways to educate ourselves about not only this current moment, which is horrifying, to see Black people just murdered at will in plain view on screen is maddening. But we need to find a way to address it. And I think the only way that we're going to address it effectively instead of in spurts, stop and start. When the crisis is over, then we fall asleep again until the next murder happens. So I think education is at the root of this. And by that I mean that we have to go back to the history of our country, the United States, and really learn what uh, what actually helped us to become this United States of America. What instruments were employed to bring us to this moment? And I'm starting with the slave codes. These police abuses are not happening randomly. And I don't know if I need to say that, but I will anyway, that we are very much aware that all police are not corrupt and white supremacist bigots. We understand that. We know that. Many of our family members are there. Having said that, I'll refer us to the more recent image of the white gentleman, very elderly gentleman, doing one of the demonstration, was actually shoved to the ground by police and injured badly. And when one of the uh, policemen was inspired to go and help him, the other policeman stopped him, prevented him from administering any aid to this gentleman. So then the idea of the blue wall comes. And so how do we talk about reformation, reforming the police department? And again, acknowledging that many advances have been made, but there is still a very, very long way to go. So I'm convinced that if and until we understand the origins of this insanity, and I'm starting with the slave codes, how how the policing philosophy emerged out of that uh, uh, abysmal history, and then to see how we move forward to eradicate the extremism on the part of white supremacists to harm people with impunity. I mean, it's a very deep story and a sad story, but I do believe that if and until we are ready to delve into this sordid history about how we came to this place, what made it so, and what are the supports still there to make it possible to allow it to evolve and advance in so many different iterations that look progressive but in fact are not when we count the dead bodies on the ground.
Right.
So I will say that I think that we have to be in the streets to show that we are not on board for this. And if we continue to cling to the notion that we are a democracy, then we'll have to test it and see if, in fact, we are a democracy. Right now, it doesn't look like that at all because all of the institutions that we were taught were created to safeguard and protect the democracy, have failed to put a stop to any of the aggressors against people who are most vulnerable in the society. And in fact, now those who dare to stand on the side of the oppressed are also penalized for this. So let's see what we are prepared to do. I'm recalling 9/11, for instance, when we were under siege again by police forces. Now we have a more militarized police force than we had then. But my hope was that, wow, this would be the wake up call that would galvanize us to really stand out and work for substantive change. Well, that didn't happen. So now let us see where we are and what challenges we are willing to face in order to make this really a more perfect union. We have a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Sister Aisha, for this. And I couldn't agree more that we need to learn more about the history. And that's why I always say to people that we have to deal with the pandemic of 1619, when the enslaved, ship landed in Jamestown for the first time. So that's a history. That is the pandemic is still continuing. So we have to deal with that, and that's true. Transformation of police. We all saw what happened in Buffalo, New York, to the elderly man there, and also we saw other incidences as well across the country. So that's again another strong indication that transformation here is needed. Thank you, Sister Aisha Al-Adawiya. She is the founder of Women's in Islam and based in New York. Thank you for that. So moving on to you, Rabbi David Saperstein. I want to turn to you here, and you heard what Professor Jimmy Jones has said about putting into context about police and prejudice in our nation, and what is our prophetic voices here. So if you want to touch upon these two themes, and the third one from the Jewish theology, what is calling us to the prophetic paradigm. Rabbi Saperstein is the Director Emeritus of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. David.
Well, it's a pleasure always to be talking to the ISNA community, and I'm delighted to be with my distinguished colleagues here. This is an extraordinary moment, and it feels that we're at a crossroads. The conflation of the COVID-19 crisis and the George Floyd crisis and everything that incident represents about America, each one reinforcing the other, because the same disparity of opportunities, disparity of access to healthcare and education, the higher rates of affliction by COVID-19 in the communities of color, in Native American communities, and in the African American community, most especially, is of the same nature as and caused by some of the same structural problems in our society, as is the police violence so disproportionately targeting communities of color, and particularly the African American community here. So we're in a moment, and moments of crisis often reflect something about an individual who faces a crisis, their character, their courage, their determination, and it reflects this about our society as well. At our moment of crisis, one can make the same observation at the global level, because both racism and COVID-19 are global problems that cannot be addressed except on a global level. We are all in this together. So first, the police. The police are us. Let's never forget that. The police is American society. If there is racism in policing, there's racism in America. And it doesn't matter how many good police there are. It doesn't matter that the majority may be good people who never have problems of this kind. In the structure of it, we find the continuation of the racism that both undergird and flowed from slavery. One of America's two original sins. The other, of course, being the genocidal activity targeting Native American populations in America. This can't be addressed without addressing this structural issue that we face here. So we know a lot of ways to deal with the symptoms of the policing problem. Here, the questions of community policing, of trying to increase the number of police who actually live in the communities that they serve, getting people out of the cars and talking to people on the street, becoming friends with them, knowing their life story, having civil review boards who can really address issues of excessive police force and violence. Here, having the transparency of incidents that happen so they can't be papered over, they can't be hidden, and the police departments will be accountable. We could go down a list of 20 steps that have to be taken. But in the end, if we don't deal with the underlying problem of racism, white privilege in America, and recognize we're in this together, we're never going to be able to make these changes. So that's what we're called to do. Let me just say one thing more, and then we'll continue in later conversations on this. The religious communities have a unique role in addressing these issues. All religions, not just the Abrahamic religions, all religions have a distinct role. First, you don't solve these problems without changing people. The way they think, the way they see themselves in relation to the world, the sense of perspective they have, the empathy that they have for others, the compassion they have for others. We have to change people. And religious communities engage with people from the moment they're born and have the opportunity to shape their values and their experiences that help shape what a person will be, who a person will be. Secondly, we have to deal with policies that are bad and flawed in our country. In almost every aspect of the criminal justice system, it's not just the police, is rampant with racism built into it. Policies, our prophetic mission of speaking truth to power is needed more than ever. And we are an institution that can model for other institutions in which institutional racism is built into the structures of our society, both in America and globally. Here, economic inequities, the difference between the rich and the poor, the vast numbers of people who are being held down by economic inequalities in our nation and across the globe, the educational inequalities, the healthcare inequalities, it's built into the structures. We can model in our structures what it is like to act differently in our society and call to task those in our congregations who play roles in those institutions. So we have a unique role to play in this, and that's an enormous responsibility, but also an enormous opportunity. And let's hope that we are worthy of the expectations of the God who has charged us to bring God's message and to do God's work here on earth.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Saperstein, for this really very important call for our religious communities here, what need to be done to basically support this institutional transformation and reforming changes that we're looking for. I want to turn it to you, Dr. Catherine Arsborn. Dr. Catherine Arsborn is the director of Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, is the national campaign set up almost 10 years ago to stand with American Muslim communities and to adhere to American ideals. So Dr. Catherine, I want to also to give you the opportunity to speak to the theme of this discussion tonight. And also I have a follow-up question to you as well. So after you, maybe you can give us a few minutes in the context of the theme of police prejudice and the prophetic paradigm.
Yeah, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. And really grateful to be in conversation with such esteemed panelists who have so much experience and insight to offer on this issue. And as my co-panelists have really brought up, this isn't just about George Floyd. It's not just about Breonna Taylor or the many other names we could say here as part of this. It's about the long-term systemic racism that plagues this country. And that shows up in racialized policing, that shows up in these killings, that also shows up in the disproportionate way that COVID-19 has impacted Black and Brown communities, and seeing this as part of a much bigger picture than the murder of George Floyd that brought it out to the streets in many ways. And so, and I think it's important here to recognize also how intertwined this is with, at Shoulder to Shoulder, we focus on addressing anti-Muslim discrimination. And that comes from the same roots that we're seeing the roots of white supremacy that uphold and allow for racism and discrimination with its many heads to plague our society, and that on the flip side of that we have to see this as a shared responsibility. So I'm coming to this conversation as a white Christian, which I believe means I have a responsibility to be deeply listening to and following the lead of those who are most directly impacted by this ongoing systemic structural crisis. And in this conversation, I see my role as really sharing some of what I've learned and we at Shoulder to Shoulder have learned on our journey to what it means to learn and to relearn what it is to be an ally. And really beyond that, to think about it as a companyship, to see it as a shared responsibility rather than something that people who don't see themselves as directly impacted are somehow opting into as a sort of extracurricular sort of thing, but something that is really core to who we are as humans. If we want to be acting in a way that upholds common humanity and who we want to be as a country. One of my teachers in graduate school was Dr. Vincent Harding, who wrote many wonderful things, but one essay that has really stuck with me is this essay he wrote called "Is America Possible?" And I always come back to that in thinking about this, because we're talking about the roots of racism in our country, and if we don't look at that honestly, then we're not going to get anywhere in addressing these manifestations of it as they come up. But we also have to have this hope of America being possible, and that if we are working together and seeing it as a shared responsibility, that we can make it possible. And so for white people in particular, we have the responsibility to address and repent of the fact that this issue of racism has plagued our nation from the beginning, and that Christianity has been evoked to support racism. But that we can also draw on Christian teachings. And if we are, in my perspective, digging into what Jesus really taught and modeled in Christianity, that Christianity can be used to help people know how to fight back against this, the white Christian community in particular, to show up and to step into challenging places to have these conversations. And so I have more to say on what that looks like, but I'll pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine. This is really very helpful here, and particularly touch upon the teaching of Christianity as well, which is really, we wanted to dig deeper into the discussion here to see how our Abrahamic traditions here, and of course all other faith communities, as mentioned by Rabbi Saprastine earlier, can work together to basically look into this transformation we're looking into here. But I want to follow up to you, Catherine, with a question. I was watching the news yesterday, and I saw, and you are based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I saw the 10,000, demonstrators and people, protesting this racism in our nation today. This demonstration in particular was organized by teenagers, 4 teenagers. In fact, they don't know even each other. They just know each other through Twitter. And they get together and did a peaceful demonstration. This is really bring me to the role of youth, not only here in our nation, in this particular moment right now and leading demonstrations and organizing and all of that, but around the world. My own brother, who lives in the UK, his name is Mus'ab, and probably he's watching right now this program. He was in the front of demonstration in the UK as well, leading demonstrations on this racism. So, so the role of youth here is really critical. And when we look into statistics as well, we see that, youth are like 60%, 70% of our populations. So any particular message and how is that maybe give us hope to lead to this kind of transformation?
Yeah, it was really incredible to see these youth organizing and just how many people answered their call. And I think this is true in this movement and in other movements we see for justice and equality and equity in our world, that we see youth voices coming to the surface. And if we're listening and following them, I think we'll learn a lot, because the youth have no choice. This is the future that they are walking into. I mean, that's true for non-youth, of course, as well, but the youth are, see themselves as sort of creating the future that they want. And so it's not optional for them to be engaged and involved. And I think that they also can look and see that things haven't been resolved. And so we have to be open to and listening to the youth for new ways of thinking about things, new ways of doing things. And it's really energizing and inspiring to see the way that youth are showing up in this, and to really think about what it means to sort of step back and listen to what they have to bring to the table here.
That's very good. Thank you, Dr. Catherine here. But Professor Jones, I mean, from your own experience, have you seen like this is different this time around? And you can see the youth there in the leadership. You can see also, as I mentioned earlier, the whole of society approach into this. How you see and how that gives you hope that these things are going to the right direction and we may see these changes happening in our lifetime.
Yes, last night I spoke to a group of youth at a masjid. Of course, everything is Zoom these days, and they organized the whole program. And this gives me hope, because there are still young people who they call themselves woke now. They're woke enough to know what's going on. It's hard not to see the devastation of the deaths that we have in the United States right now because of COVID-19. It's hard not to see the people being killed in police-involved shootings. And these young people wanted to do something, and they organized the program. And they're not the only ones. They're organizing marches, they're organizing programs. They're also building bridges in places like Minnesota. I know some people personally who went over to the police department. A young black male, happens to be a nephew of mine, went over to the police department and delivered a pie to the chief of police as a peace offering, because right now, young black males, given what happened in Minneapolis and what happened to George Floyd, are on edge, but to build the bridges at this time. So it indeed gives me hope. And young people are stepping up, and I think it's our role to educate. I'm an educator. It's our role to remind them of history. It's our role to remind them of the people who went before, who were very successful, like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's, the Harriet Tubmans, the Sojourner Truths. I mean, there are many, many role models other than the extreme role models that we see often flashed at us on TV.
Thank you so much. I want to really pose the same question. I see maybe Rabbi Separis, want to add to that, but I want to come to you, Sister Aisha there, and basically the same question. I know that you left Selma, Alabama in 1960 or so to New York, but probably definitely you are seeing these changes happening now, and now you live in New York. And now here we go. Our nation is struggling with addressing issues of racism. and the society, how we're gonna change this, as a collective voice to make changes that is, basically bring justice to everyone.
Well, my town was not Selma. It was another small town near there, but the same vicinity.
Okay.
I think that as elders in the community, uh, certainly young people are going to do what they're going to do. And I support them in every way. But we cannot leave the burden on their shoulders for them to carry into their future. I think that the system is corrupt and racist to the core, our American system, in all of its manifestations. And it stems from our history. And I know that many of us do not like to talk this way about our country and the shortcomings that we have and witness every day. But now again, we are confronted with that, and we have to be truthful and honest and speak, from a place of integrity. We are in very serious trouble here, and we profess religious traditions and how we are committed to those things. But when it comes to confronting the gross injustices in our society, we don't often show up in a powerful way. We can no longer sustain the band aid approach. We have to do major surgery. There's a cancer here that's been allowed to grow and metastasize. And if we don't take care of it, it's going to destroy us all. Uh, to our white friends, many of you are family as well. Uh, I'm going to call on you to do more than be an ally. I'm finding now the term to be too mild. I want you to show up as fellow human beings, you know, in the society, because this is an issue for everyone, not just African American people, not just the largest society, all of us. But I think that I'm moving away from the term allyship to full human human beings who want to support and value the human dignity of every living being. So that's my approach these days. And sometimes it gets very uncomfortable, but I think it we can bring change only if we are willing to address those hard issues. And they're very deep issues. And, for years we've all been involved in interfaith work and dialogue for many, many years, many of us. Now it's time to move from the uh, conference table, to providing real substantive change rooted in integrity for our society to thrive, not just our individual communities, but for everyone to thrive. And if and until we do that, we will be returning here every time an atrocity happens to apply the same band aid that we are now finding ourselves, unfortunately, trying to patch over. But I'm advocating very strongly that we take the courage and the will to go deep back into the history of this country to know who we are as a country. We must do this and then be willing to take the steps to bring the change that we say we want and that we're willing to bring about, not just for ourselves, but for our children. I have one grandson and four great grandsons. So this issue of is present with me all day, every day. And I also have granddaughter. So we all have our families to think of. It's not a view, from a perched position, but it's a living reality for all of us. And again, I'm going to be very tough in my talk these days about pushing us to not be comfortable in our positions of perceived power, because this can all be taken away from us instantly. See? So we have to be willing to risk something for the sake of our own integrity and for our children to see us as ethical human beings on the planet. I lost the sound.
Yes, now I just
Okay.
need to unmute myself. No, thank you
Okay.
so much. And so you are moving us forward to a new terminology of bringing us more closer and working, together. Rabbi Saprastina, I know that you wanted to also address that issue as well. But I wanted to urge the participants here, if you do have a question, please post your questions to the chat there, and we will collect and we will present your question to the panel here. We already got a few questions that I will present them later, but please continue to send us your questions as well. Rabbi Saperstein.
Just to make the obvious point that this is not a new dynamic with young people. Dr. King was 26 years old. John Lewis was younger. From where Aisha came from, Stokely Carmichael was so active down in that area. Kwame Ture was in his mid-20s. Here after Parkland and the shooting, there were a lot of the organizing around the country in terms of gun control happened from people who were high school and college students all across America. Much of the environmental movement is energized by young people. One of the important things I think for those of us who are a bit older is to try to empower them, train them. As you know, here in the entity that I run in Iran, in the Reform Jewish movement, one of the things we specialized in was creating intensive skills training seminars for high school and college kids. Over the years, 60,000 people, young people, have gone through these programs. It has a lasting impact. It shapes their lives. They're all over Washington now. They're in all kinds of causes for social justice across America, across the world here. And we need to be sure that at this particular moment, that whatever their political views, that they see democracy as something that gives them the ability to determine the future of the country. And above all, they get out and vote. They use their legitimate democratic rights to protest, to write, to speak, to vote, to help shape the future of the country. I don't want them to give up on the structures of our democracy here. And there really is a danger of this. People are so cynical, so divided over our politics in this country. Here, we've lost a sense of the commonweal that unifies us and holds us together. And those who engage in hate crimes and divisive rhetoric, they do it hoping to tear us apart. And we have to model a different kind of unity and respect for those who hold differing political views or differing religious identities, different racial identities. But we have to stand together to address these problems, even if we disagree on the best approaches. And certainly, it seems to me, just to return to our theme, we have to be absolutely clear in America that the ingrained, institutionalized racism that has marked this country has to come to an end. Here, we can't lose the momentum that Dr. Jones talked about of the young people who have awakened at this moment to say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, as Fannie Lou Hamer said so famously. We can't lose that at this moment. Here, we can help sustain that. We can help support them. We can help empower them. We can help train them. But ultimately, they're going to create this new world, and we have to work together with them to achieve that.
That is, thank you. But David, any specific kind of action items for religious leaders? You know, we have been working together, and ISNA is involved in the interreligious collaboration and interfaith, and we strengthening our trust and confidence and all of that. And this moment requires even more collaboration. And Sister Aisha earlier said that, we cannot afford just a dialogue anymore. We have to do more than that. So any specific kind of suggestions for the institutional change that you mentioned, particularly for interreligious communities to do to help achieve that?
Yeah, here, let me just pick up on Sister Aisha's comment before. Dialogue is crucially important to understand each other, but it doesn't build the closeness, the trust, the deep understanding that comes from a range of other things. So for example, working together on common problems. We all face common problems in our local communities, or as we see in our global community. We all have the ability to work together in this structure to solve those problems. When you work together to build a house for a homeless person, when you work together to protest out in the streets, to ask for change in the way our policing forces run, when you work together to stand up against religious persecution in Sudan, here, you can help bring change in those places. In the act of doing that, you learn to trust each other, you learn to work together, working to invite each other into our homes, to celebrations of holidays, of life cycle celebrations that we have, introduces us to the world that is often a kind of foreign world of the other, otherwise, because we don't have access to it. We can help create access in interfaith programs like that. And we have to start young. We have to start with the youth groups. And I know a lot of people are worried about it because they think that kind of work will, that kind of joint effort with teenagers may increase intermarriage and people moving away from their religion. So they're hesitant to do that. But working together, modeling that, you're visiting in our churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, other places of worship at a young age, so they're comfortable in understanding the difference that people have. There's a full range of things that have done, and you and I can quote dramatically the number of real heroes in the interfaith community who've stood up for each other, who, when Christians are going to be attacked in Pakistan, and imams stand between the mob and those people, what that does. Or in Burma, when Miktila almost went up in flames and an interfaith coalition calmed things down. Here, the work that you've done in Central African Republic, that's been so remarkable, Muhammad. Here, I think that's what ISNA is about. I think it's what it envisions. I think it's why it helped create Shoulder to Shoulder, not just to be of help to the Muslim community, but to model what it's really like to learn to trust and know each other by working together for our common problems.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's really bring me to Catherine Osborne here, Director of Shoulder to Shoulder. And it is correct. When interreligious communities, and you remember, David, clearly, and Catherine probably gonna substantiate this, when we had the first meeting almost 10 years ago, ISNA called for an emergency interfaith summit, and major religious leaders and head of denominations came to Washington for that, to address issues of Islamophobia. But when we were together, working together, we were live on all of kind of media outlets. Then when we're together, the authority listened to us. If you remember, David, we got a call that when the White House saw the press conference, when Eric Holder was our Attorney General, saw that, he said, I want to meet with this group at 4 o'clock the same day. So Catherine, from your own experience, you represent a coalition, a huge coalition. And from your experience, addressing issues of Islamophobia, and you made huge successes, and you brought the U.S. Conference of Catholics together, the National Council of Churches, majority of the Jewish communities in the country, and majority of Christian denominations in the nation to stand with Muslim communities. But how is that kind of coalition could help address what we are facing here? Because these issues are interlinked. They are not separate. I know you are focusing on a specific issue, but there is link there.
Right, right. And I think that's where it's so important for us to be paying attention to what faith communities are doing right now. The member communities of Shoulder to Shoulder are engaged deeply on this issue, often in coalition with one another in how they are addressing this. So, you know, I think of some of the work. Just the other day, one of our team members was at a prayer service outside of well, it was supposed to be just outside of St. John's Church, Lafayette Square, just across from the White House, where the day before there had been protesters cleared for the president to stand with a Bible. And the next day, clergy from a number of the different groups that are part of Shoulder to Shoulder showed up there to have a prayer service and solidarity vigil with what is going on right now. And I think that when we're watching what's happening, we see faith communities across the country working together and standing up and following the lead of, in many cases, following the lead of what the folks who are most directly impacted by this issue are saying. And so I also think of, you know, for instance, Sojourners, which is an evangelical organization, their work on racialized policing, on voting rights and voter suppression, and so many ways that that this issue comes from sort of the high level view of systematic racism into the nitty gritty ways that this shows up in our society. And we see faith communities doing so much work in collaboration around this. And I think I take Sister Aisha's comments on allyship. I think it's so important, and these are conversations that we see happening around those who are engaging with the conversation about what allyship means or looks like right now. And many have suggested abandoning that word for accompanyship or some other terms that have been suggested, but really trying to pull people into seeing this as a shared responsibility, as something that we have common humanity around, and that we don't see it as one person coming alongside someone else who's in trouble and helping them with their problem, but really seeing this as something that's so core to all of our humanity and bound up in the system that we're all living in some way. And so seeing it as this shared responsibility, I think is so important. So I think the lessons we've learned from the allyship work or the accompaniment work around Islamophobia through Shoulder to Shoulder and beyond, these lessons are so important for the current moment too. And one other thing I want to note on this is that I think part of why Shoulder to Shoulder has been successful in certain ways of thinking about that word is because we see the work as both internal and external. So there's an external component of this work where faith leaders are showing up for statements and press conferences and lifting their voices through op-eds, lifting their voices through contacting elected officials, lifting their voices through just the year after the founding press conference of Shoulder to Shoulder. Rabbi Saperstein and others were involved in speaking at the Peter King hearings that many may remember from Congress. And so this very feet to the ground action that has to accompany these moments of declaring solidarity, that these actions that show solidarity in a very deep way, especially when there's legislation or systems that need addressed, is so important. So there's the external level of being good allies or accompaniers on this work, but I think also a huge piece of it is the internal work that needs to happen within communities that perhaps are not as directly impacted. So thinking about, in this case, white Christian communities from my own perspective, the internal work that has to happen, the conversations that white Christians need to lead with white Christians. And I think that can be taken to other communities as well, in thinking about who needs to be leading the conversations internally to move folks along on this issue. And so I think balancing both the external work and the internal work within one's own community around this is so critical for moving forward.
Yeah, Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. That's really very helpful framing here, upgrading this allyship to something that could bring more tangible results that we wanna see all together. I do have a question that is posted here, and again, I want to encourage participants to send these questions to us. But this question is to the panel here, and any one of you feel that you want to jump in the beginning, please, feel free to do so. The question is, can we, just a second, let me see the question here. How can we compel people in leadership positions at all levels about the realities of the blue wall, as sister notes, and powerful police unions that are so destructive? So that's a question, and probably it's about the strategy, how we could really basically trying to address those issues, and there are some walls that we have to address them before we achieve any institutional kind of change.
Well, I'd like to jump in here. I think that we cannot be successful until we do just that we address it. And again, as I said earlier, these cannot be band-aid approaches. After 9/11, for instance, in New York City, we brought together a coalition of all kinds of people to critique the behavior of the police department in terms of how the Muslim community was being profiled, targeting out children, uh, infiltrating mosques and other places where Muslims congregated. And it had very little result. I mean, we saw some movement, I would say minor movement compared to what we are reliving now. So I'm wondering, to what extent do these activities really impact the core issues that we're struggling with? And again, I think that part of the issue is that we are very selective in terms of how we identify problems and where they originate. And so I think that we have to be more courageous, more honest in our identification of the issues, the source of the issues, and then come together collectively to once and for all address them in an honest manner. And I don't think that we've done that yet.
Thank you, Sister Aisha. Anyone would like to address this issue? How we can address these walls as we move on?
Look, in the beginning, I listed a whole bunch of reforms that could happen in terms of the way police departments function that I think would contribute to changing the mentality about the blue wall, about always covering over, protecting each other, building in structures of transparency, civilian review boards, different kind of training programs. What we know from the studies that have been done, a lot of this has been tried, and it is not yet really tipped the seesaw. So it requires kind of the conflation of a number of these different techniques with the community, not dissipating its energy, demanding that there be responsiveness, there be reporting, there be accountability on these things. Taken together, I think it can really address these problems. There are many places where the police unions are helpful. There are many places where they become obstructionists to reform and change. I hope there will be greater confidence by the unions, and I'm a great believer in unions here. I hope there'll be increased confidence in the unions once we show that this can be done in a way that will benefit the police as well as the public.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Professor Jones.
Yes.
Yes, do you have any ideas how we can address these blue walls as we move on to institutional change? Because some of these are obstacles on our way.
The blue walls are usually run by city budgets and city mayors. They don't have their own authority. And so here in New Haven, there's been a movement led by my ex-wife for a police review board and several other people in the community. And so the point is that if you want to address this, you have to address the local political structure. You have to sit down, is because in New Haven, like in many other cities, it's the mayor who sets the budget. It's the mayor who appoints the police chief. And so therefore, the push has to be put on the mayor. And you can see across countries, where people have done this, you find more responsible police departments. There are some responsible police departments, but as Sister Edwia makes clear, you have to confront it. And I say the way you confront it is by becoming politically active in your local community, making sure you elect people to whatever the governing body is there, and making sure you put pressure on whomever the mayor is.
Very helpful. Thank you so much, Professor Jones. Catherine, you want to add to this, answering this question?
Sure. I mean, I'll just note that, in kind of following the conversations around this, of course, there are differences of opinion on exactly how to address these issues. But I think that, one place that a lot of ideas have been sort of collected and systematized around this is around the collaborative Campaign Zero platform that has, these sort of 8 steps or 8 different aspects that need to be addressed in order to really see this change. And I think it's helpful to look towards folks like that who have really worked through and thought through what a comprehensive reform of the system looks like, while again noting that this isn't something that necessarily everyone agrees upon in the space.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine. Professor Jones, I wanted to go back to the prophetic paradigm in the theme of this discussion tonight. And that's really, we know that the issue of justice and equality and no racism, it is very clear in our holy book, the Quran, and also Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He mentioned that in a number of sayings and hadith and practice as well. And even his last sermon was focused on that very aspect, no racism. So how we can take those teachings that we have as Muslim communities to be more active, to bring this teaching that we have up there, so that we can use these teachings to help in the institutional change that we are looking for.
Sure. First of all, let's understand that there's no magic in the words. There's no magic in speaking the words of the Quran. There's no magic in repeating the hadith over and over. There's no magic in repeating the last speech of Prophet Muhammad, والسلام, peace be upon him, over and over. This is what we tend to do. That's number one. But what we need to do is plumb the strategies that he used in order to bring about the kind of community he brought about. Let's make no mistake about it. The reason why these issues were addressed during this time is because they were issues during this time. There were people who discriminated against people. We're talking about a tribal community 1,400 years ago. And so therefore, it was instructive how he dealt with it. Just some quick examples. One is when he went from Mecca to Medina, there's this question, it's like going from New York to for instance, going from a metropolitan area to an agricultural area. He had to figure out how to bring these communities together. And he was brilliant in terms of the merger of these two communities by making them brothers to one another in a concept that they understood. That's number one. Number two, he was called from Mecca to Medina to be a peacemaker, Muslims. That Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was called not to give dawah, not to call people to Islam, but to keep people from warring, from people from killing one another, because he was known as the trustworthy one. So what does that mean for us as religious people and Muslims? That we ought to be about the business of being the people in our communities, large and small, who are the trustworthy. We ought to be people in the community, large and small, who are the bridge builders. And this is something that you're already doing. But we need to model this and not act as if somehow back there it was the perfect Islam, because it wasn't. Even after Prophet Muhammad died, peace be upon him, they tried to take the leadership from a young boy because he was mixed race. He was mixed race. Osama was mixed race, and he was young. And Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, he refused to do it. And so it wasn't because there weren't problems. The reality is that our prophet, peace be upon him, stood up in face of problems, stood up and faced, I mean, we know about the infanticide of killing girl babies. He stood up against entrenched practices that were against the marginalized. This is what we're called to do today.
Yeah, but yeah, no, thank you. That's very clear. But he also, when he went to Medina, he also created a constitution
Absolutely.
that bring everyone together, regardless of any religious orientation, to address those very issues of, you know, racism and all of that, and freedom as a whole.
And still people rebel. Let's just remember, people rebel.
Yes.
But he dealt with it. But I'm just saying the narrative, we act as if it's either or, either everything is nice and rosy.
Right.
No, he worked at it. He worked at it in Mecca. He worked at it in Medina. He worked at it before he got prophecy in Mecca. And so it is hard, continuous work, calling the people, as the rabbis say, to calling the people to God's word and to the way of God. This is hard, continuous work that begins with yourself, with making sure that you're listening to God and that you're not listening to whatever your desires are, right? Which was many of us do. We just react to things. Make sure that you have a prayerful life, and make sure that you have a life where you study your text and stay connected to it. So when you hit the streets, you're not soaking in all the craziness. It's crazy out there, all the crazy ideas that are out there, and reacting only to them.
Right. So, you know, preparedness is important.
Absolutely.
We have to prepare for that. Rabbi Saperstein, from Judaism perspective, I mean, how would this, I mean, we talked about this in the Islam and how all of these teachings and preparedness and how to strategize. There is no magic in our scripture to change things, but we have to have a strategy.
Well, first of all, our tradition is comprised of many things. So it's not just what is in our sacred texts. It is also the lessons of our history. Here, I come from a religious group of people who have been amongst the quintessential victims of religious persecution over the centuries. We know all too well what happens when good people stand by while people are being victimized. We know the story of the liberation that comes in the Passover holiday, what it means to move from slavery to freedom. Here, we know the arduous journey to get through the wilderness of the world as it is to the world we would like it to be. Here, you know, so that's part of our history as well. And we know that we flourished in those communities, all too rare, that welcomed us. More often that was a Muslim community than it was a Christian community. Here, so the Jewish community flourished in Babylonia for hundreds of years, in the golden age of Spain for a long period of time. So there were, all of these are woven into what we learn as well. I think in terms of the theology of this, looking at our tradition here, I would make 2 points that, like your traditions, and I say this to everyone, not just to Muslims, but for everyone who is part of this call, your tradition took ideas that were very particularist ideas to your tradition, and were able to explain them in universal forms, accessible to all people. Judaism actually built that into our system. We believe that if you believe in the one God and you are an ethical person, you have a path to heaven that is as accessible to you as the Jewish path is to us as Jews. So that kind of pluralism, embrace of pluralism was built into the Jewish system. There's a strand of Jewish theology that I'm particularly fond of that argues when God created the universe, God chose to leave one part of creation undone. And that was the creation of a world of justice and peace. And then God gave us something not known anywhere else in all of creation, the ability to understand the difference between right and wrong, and the concomitant responsibility to choose good over evil, the blessing over the curse, life over death. And then in our sacred text, God entrusted to our care a blueprint for how to create that world of justice and peace. But if God's word is to live here on earth, it will be because of the choices we make. It will be because we carry out that plan to create, God's plan to create that world of justice and peace. I saw in the chat box a question about the environment. Is there a more intuitively religious issue than for us to recognize that God has entrusted all of God's creation to us, and we are held accountable to what we do with that creation to ensure that God's benefits, God's beauty, God's bounty is available for the next generations that it has been for us here. That's doing God's work on earth. And it's a great Orthodox Jewish scholar, Isidore Twersky, said, by allowing us to be partners with God, God has ennobled humanity, raised us above mere biological existence, and given to our lives meaning and destiny and purpose. Calling us to that partnership is the most extraordinary thing about the task that we have. And we just have to prove that finally we can make God's word really flourish here on earth for every one of God's children, no matter their race, no matter their gender, no matter where they live. All are entitled to partake in what God has entrusted us.
Thank you, David. And I mean, to that, we have to work together in this partnership to do that undone creation of justice and peace. Catherine, you want to add to that? You know, how we could use our own theology and make it into practice and strategies.
Yeah, I mean, from a Christian perspective, I think, the teachings on this are not hidden. They're very much on the surface. The teachings of seeing the image of God in each person, teachings on human dignity, teachings on loving one's neighbor as oneself, loving God and loving one's neighbor as the two foremost commandments that are pointed to, and I think that sometimes these can be a bit trivialized in the sense of thinking of love as something that is kind of just this mushy-gushy sort of approach. But when we lean into the depth of these teachings, I think we see a clear calling to address and resist racism and discrimination, and the ways in which people are not being afforded the human dignity that God has given to all of us. But I think the other piece from Christianity for me is thinking about the not just the words and the teachings of Jesus, but the way in which he really called out unjust power in so many different ways, and did it in many different ways. I think of the scene. There's the scene in the New Testament where Jesus is overturning tables of money changers at the temple, and just thinking about this as part of a story of the need to call out unjust power. And that is something that is woven throughout Christianity, but isn't always necessarily drawn out in the teachings of love. I think sometimes those things are seen as opposing teachings, but I think those are actually teachings that are really wrapped up together, because if you love your neighbor, if you're listening to your neighbor's pain and that injustice, then the call to come alongside and to fight that against the injustice, to me, is such a clear teaching from Christianity that I think goes for people of all faiths and backgrounds, that we can all draw upon and learn from.
Great, thank you, Catherine, for that articulation. Where there is a question in the chat, and I see that Rabbi Saperstein talked about that, but I want to come to you, Sister Aisha.
Yes, please.
Before you comment, I have a question for you.
Okay.
And that is, and that's really the role of woman here. And you founded Women in Islam. And we know that even talking about the history of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his engagement and, women's leadership at that time, and the interreligious aspect as well. He dealt with women of different faith during his time. So how all of that, now can contribute again to this whole of society approach. No one left behind. No one is left behind, so that we can attain that institutional change.
Well, that's a very big question.
That needs a whole lecture, huh?
Well, it's good in that I think that again, as Black women generally, and as Black Muslim women in particular, we have a unique role and have played a unique role in this fight for freedom and human dignity. And I think that, again, education is key, not only about the US Constitution, but we also must come to understand the deeper meaning of our own Islamic traditions. And I feel compelled to reference Malcolm X in this conversation, because he happens to be he continues to be one of my mentors in terms of talking, charting, showing the way of the people who are now classified as the underclass, the disenfranchised, and how it's possible to maintain one's dignity through it all and rise to a position of power through one's ethics and morality. And that's what Malcolm does for me, right? So I think, again, to stand visibly, strongly, and powerfully on the side of people who are suffering, right? We cannot hide behind our scriptures and our sacred texts. Rather, we have to understand them deeply. And within that understanding, we're called to some kind of powerful action. And at the level where people live, not in ivory towers, right? But on the streets, in the prisons, in the ghettos, where people suffer the most. Women, for sure, are a part of that. And I think that women often and continue to lead the charge in this area. Women are the ones, it is our sons that are sent to war, right? So I think that women have the first right of protest to say no more war. We will not go to the army and kill innocent people, that will not do that. And that will teach our children early on that this is not an honorable thing to do. We want to do that instead of praising people who go to unjust wars, because we're conditioned to believe that that's an honorable thing to do. It's not, but it takes courage and fortitude to resist that, to say no. And I know that this is a very difficult question to raise here, but we must, and we have to be willing to model for the younger generation through examples of the past. We have a lot of issues. We have political prisoners, for instance. We have people who have dared to speak up. Rabbi Saperstein mentioned some of those. And where are they today? We have to understand that this happens in this culture because we still have not been willing to challenge the system of oppression, the systemic oppression that we live under. And we understand that it's global for sure, but we have to act at home first before we can exert any influence elsewhere. So again, I'm calling on us as faith leaders, as members of the community, as a Muslim woman, as a Black Muslim woman, as a human being, that we take very seriously the commitment to bring some real change. And we must get away from the rhetoric, the talking head. We're learning Zoom now. So I have 3 of these Zoom talks today. At the end of the day, what does it mean? What do we say, to our people? How do we mobilize them to go forward if we don't speak truth, real truth to power? And that's what we're being called to do now. So I want to appreciate everyone's comments here, and I hope that you receive my message in the spirit that it's given, which is love. And I think that we can only bring peace to this world if we challenge the gross injustices that are plaguing our planet nowadays.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And what a beautiful way of really toward the end of this conversation. So we do have a couple of minutes left here, and I want to turn it to you, Catherine, David, and Professor Johnson. Take maybe 30 seconds, each one of you, to close us up here. But also there was a question about environment, but the second part of the question talk about the fundamental changes are required to deal with the remnants of racism and bigotry from American society. Do you think the current political leadership and the larger society is ready for that? This is a political question, but the 30 seconds with the closing remarks. Catherine, I want to begin with you.
Okay, 30 seconds. Those are big questions. But I mean, I'll say no. I don't think that leadership in society is necessarily ready, but I don't think that matters in the sense that I think that sometimes these strides have to be made and then people have to catch up. People have to come along. So I don't think that waiting until everyone in political leadership and in society is ready for eradicating racism. I think that if we wait, then we'll be waiting forever. So that's my response to that question, and I think that's my 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. David.
All right, so I agree with Catherine. So now my 25 seconds more are, we will not deal with the police problem until we deal with criminal justice and the racism in the system. From the number of times someone gets stopped, to the number of times they got brought into custody, to the number of how they're treated once they're brought into custody, whether they'll get bail, whether they'll have adequate legal representation, will they, when they're sentenced, will they get a disproportionate sentence? How will they be treated in jail? When will they get parole, and how will they be, on every level? There is racism built into the system. We will not deal with the problem of police until we reform the entire criminal justice system. And I simply wanted to lift that up in terms of what our theme is today. That's part of our prophetic witness also, to help bring about that day.
Thank you so much, David, for that very clear roadmap here. Professor Jones, you are muted.
What pops into my mind is the idea, to whom much is given, much is required. The fact of the matter is that there are people amongst us who are privileged to live a little bit better than the rest of us, and that we are called to step up and deal with the injustices, many of them we talked about this afternoon. I just want to say, within the African-American community, the largest number of people in the African-American community are not poor people who live in the inner city like I do. The largest number of people in the African-American community these days are, quote, middle-class people. And I don't think we, those of us who make middle-class salaries but don't have middle-class wealth, we have mined this, and we haven't stepped up and to do the kinds of things that Sister Aisha and the rabbi and the doctor talk about, because I think people often think of us as victims. The whole community is being victims, and that the over 50 years, a quick book to read is Disintegration by Eugene Robinson, that talks about the dramatic change in the African American community. We need to, as Booker T. Washington say, to cast down our buckets where we are and understand that we have a collective obligation to deal with to be on the side of the oppressed. As Malcolm X said, I'm for truth no matter who speaks it. I'm for justice no matter who's for or against. I'm a human being first and foremost. And as such, I'm for whomever or whatever benefits humanity as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a beautiful ending, Professor Jones. And I'm not sure, there is a new documentary about Malcolm X just came out called Malcolm X and the Sudanese. I'm not sure you have seen that or not.
Yes.
But it is a 26 minutes documentary, quite beautiful. I will send it to all of you.
Thank you.
To look into that. But thank you so much. What a beautiful discussion. And we thank you on behalf of the Islamic Society of North America for joining us in this interreligious discussion on institutional racism. And we will continue this in this platform through our interfaith engagement and the whole of society approach. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to those who participated with us and watch us live here. And please go to isna.net for more programmings and also support the Islamic Society of North America for what we do. Thank you again, and you have a good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you.